World War II, a war we often think about for battles in Europe and the Pacific, had people from all over the world fighting in it. African soldiers fought bravely, but their sacrifices are often forgotten. Hundreds of thousands of men from Africa were pulled into the war. Their lives changed forever by countries far from their own. Their stories, full of bravery and the unfairness of colonialism, need to be heard and understood as a key part of World War II history. These soldiers, from different backgrounds and cultures all across Africa, fought under the flags of their colonial rulers. They fought for the ideals of Britain and its allies, but also for a future where their own countries would be free from colonial rule. Understanding why they fought, what they went through, and the impact of their service is really important to understanding how complex World War II was and how it still affects us today. A huge number of Africans fought in World War II. Over 2 million Africans served in the British Army alone, and thousands more joined the Free French forces. These men came from all over Africa, from big cities in West Africa to small villages in East Africa. They were farmers, teachers, workers and students, and their lives were completely changed when they were called to fight. They joined the army for lots of different reasons. Some felt it was their duty to the British Empire, while others wanted to earn money and escape poverty. Many wanted to prove themselves and challenge the racism of the time. The idea of adventure and seeing the world also played a part. No matter why they joined, these African soldiers played a vital role in helping the Allies win, fighting bravely in some of the war's toughest battles. It was ironic that African soldiers were fighting for freedom overseas while their own countries were still ruled by colonial powers. They knew this wasn't fair, fighting for democracy and liberty while being denied those same rights at home. This made them want independence even more. What they saw and learned during the war, including different cultures and ideas, made them want freedom even more strongly. The war, in a way, helped to end colonialism by bringing together millions of Africans and showing them the ideas of freedom and self-government. The colonial powers accidentally started a firestorm of national pride that would eventually lead to the end of their empires. Getting African soldiers to join the army for World War II was a huge job because a global war needs a lot of people. Colonial leaders across Africa had to find soldiers from large and diverse areas. How they recruited people was different depending on the colony. In some places, tribal leaders and chiefs encouraged young men to join. Posters and radio announcements talking about patriotism and adventure were everywhere, trying to make men feel like it was their duty to join up and see the world. Hard times also played a big part. Because the war hurt the world's economy, many Africans saw joining the army as a way to get a steady job and support their families. Many people joined the army, but not everyone agreed with how it was done. From village life to army life, becoming a soldier. For many African recruits, going from their villages to army barracks was a huge change. They left behind everything they knew and how they lived, entering a strict world of rules and following orders. Changing from a villager to a soldier was both physical and mental, requiring them to get used to new routines, languages, and social structures. The training was hard and sometimes harsh. They did a lot of physical training, practiced with weapons and fighting techniques over and over, and were taught military discipline. For many, this experience created a sense of friendship and strong bonds between men from all sorts of different backgrounds. Racism in the army, unequal training and equipment. Even though African soldiers were dedicated and brave, they still faced the racism and discrimination common during colonial times. Segregation, a big problem in the British Army, affected everything from training and equipment to chances for promotion. African units were often given less important jobs or sent to less important battles. People didn't believe they were good fighters and their contributions weren't appreciated. The differences in equipment were obvious. African soldiers often got older weapons and not enough supplies compared to white soldiers. getting ready for anything, training for different types of war. African soldiers trained for all sorts of places they might have to fight. From the hot deserts of North Africa to the thick jungles of Southeast Asia, they were prepared to fight in very different lands and weather. Training included lots of skills from desert warfare and jungle survival to using big guns and explosives. They focused on being tough, shooting accurately, and being able to handle unfamiliar places. Even though there were language barriers and cultural differences, African soldiers were tough and adaptable, learning the skills to become strong fighters in many different places. The harsh deserts of North Africa became a major battlefield early in World War II. African soldiers were right in the middle of it. The Allies fought the Axis powers led by Germany's Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. African soldiers, mostly from East and West African colonies, fought bravely. Their contributions were essential to the Allied victory. They faced extreme desert heat, sandstorms, and constant attacks. They fought in fierce battles like El Alamein. Their bravery and skill were key to pushing back Rommel's forces. The victory at El Alamein was a major turning point. It stopped the Axis advance in North Africa, setting the stage for the Allies to eventually win there. While the fighting in North Africa was going on, another important battle happened far away in the Indian Ocean, the Battle of Madagascar. This island, a French colony, was on vital shipping routes. To stop the Japanese from building a submarine base, British and Commonwealth forces invaded in May 1942. The African troops faced tough resistance from Vichy French forces. Their bravery was crucial in capturing key ports and airfields. Securing Madagascar protected Allied supply lines. After the Allies won in North Africa, the war in Europe moved to Italy. The Italian campaign was a long, hard fight, with Allied forces fighting their way up the mountains of Italy against strong German defences. African soldiers, who had proven themselves in North Africa, were needed again. They served in many roles, from frontline infantry to support units, and their contributions were crucial to the Allied advance. The Italian campaign was full of fierce battles, often in dangerous mountain terrain. The soldiers faced harsh weather, with freezing winters and scorching summers, pushing them to their limits. They fought in key battles, including the Battle of Monte Cassino, a long and costly battle with many casualties on both sides. Despite the challenges, the African soldiers kept going, and their courage and determination helped the Allies win in Italy. The Burma campaign, jungle warfare, and the fight against Japan. Far away in the east, the Burma campaign was a brutal and often forgotten part of the fight against Japan. African soldiers, mainly from East and West African colonies, were sent to this difficult area, facing a tough enemy and the harsh Burmese jungle. The Burma campaign was full of difficult jungle warfare, disease, and ambushes. The Japanese army, known for never giving up, was a new and formidable enemy for the African troops. They learned how to fight in the jungle, developing new tactics for moving through thick vegetation and fighting the enemy up close. Knowing local languages and customs helped them gather information and build relationships with local people. Even though they faced logistical challenges and were often outnumbered, the African soldiers in Burma fought bravely and with determination, helping the Allies win in this strategically important area. Racism and discrimination on the front lines. The experience of African soldiers in World War II was deeply affected by the racism and discrimination that was everywhere in the colonial system. Even though they fought bravely alongside other Allied troops, they were often treated like second-class soldiers, facing segregation, prejudice, and disrespect. The colour bar, a strict system of racial segregation in the British military, affected every part of their service, from where they lived and the food they ate, to chances for promotion and recognition. African soldiers were often given unimportant jobs, and their combat skills and contributions were often overlooked. They were often sent to the front lines with poor equipment, expected to take on more risk, while being denied the same respect and opportunities as white soldiers. This racism made African soldiers bitter and resentful because they were risking their lives for a colonial power that treated them as inferior. Unequal burden, disparities in equipment and supplies. The unfair treatment of African soldiers wasn't just social, it also affected the equipment and supplies they received. While fighting in some of the harshest conditions imaginable, from the scorching deserts of North Africa to the humid jungles of Southeast Asia, they were often given outdated weapons, inadequate clothing, and poor medical care. This lack of resources constantly reminded them of their lower status within the Allied forces. There are many stories of African soldiers going into battle with guns that didn't work, without proper clothing for the weather, and receiving worse medical treatment than white soldiers. These inequalities hurt their morale and made it harder for them to fight effectively and survive. The lack of essential equipment and supplies made them more vulnerable, making already dangerous situations even more life-threatening. A war within a war, the psychological toll of colonial prejudice. Besides the physical challenges, African soldiers also dealt with the mental strain of fighting for a colonial power that denied them basic human rights. They knew it was hypocritical to fight for freedom and democracy overseas, while their own countries were still colonies. This contradiction made them feel disillusioned and angry, creating a war within a war as they battled both the enemy and the unfairness of the colonial system that they represented. Letters sent home from the front lines show how hard this was emotionally. Soldiers wrote about their frustration at being treated as inferior, their desire for a future free from colonial rule, and their hope that their sacrifices would lead to a fairer world. For many, the war made them more politically aware, making them want self-determination and fueling the anti-colonial movements that would spread across Africa in the following decades. Resilience and resistance, overcoming adversity and finding camaraderie. Despite the constant challenges and unfairness, African soldiers showed amazing resilience and courage throughout the war. They fought bravely in some of the toughest battles, earning the respect of both their fellow soldiers and their enemies. During the war, they formed close bonds, finding comfort and strength in their shared experiences and goals. They created tight-knit communities, sharing stories, songs, and traditions from their homes. Music especially was important for keeping up morale and creating a sense of unity. Through music, they celebrated their cultures, expressed their hopes and fears, and found moments of peace during the chaos of war. Their resilience, their unwavering spirit, and their commitment to a better future show the strength of the human spirit in the face of adversity. Broken promises, returning to a world still shackled by colonialism. The end of World War II brought joy and relief to much of the world, but for African soldiers coming home, the celebrations were bittersweet. The promises of equality and recognition made during the war felt empty as they returned to societies still under colonial rule. The very powers they had fought for didn't seem to want to give the same freedoms to their own colonies. While European veterans were treated as heroes, African veterans were often ignored. Jobs were hard to find, opportunities were limited, and promises of land or money for their service were often broken. The unfairness of fighting for freedom only to return to a life of oppression made them feel even more disillusioned and resentful. The war had changed these men forever, showing them new ideas and making them want true liberation. The seeds of dissent, wartime experiences and the rise of nationalist movements. The experiences of African soldiers during the war helped to start the growing nationalist movements across the continent. Having seen the ideals of democracy and self-determination firsthand, they came home even more determined to end the oppression that had controlled their lives for so long. The war showed that European powers weren't invincible and encouraged those who wanted freedom. Across Africa, groups of veterans became important for political action. These organizations, first created to get better treatment for ex-servicemen, quickly became centers of anti-colonial feeling. Veterans who knew how to organize, plan strategically, and had shared experiences of hardship and sacrifice played a key role in mobilizing people and turning their complaints into a powerful force for change. The war, meant to keep colonial rule in place, had accidentally started its own downfall. Recognition denied. The struggle for equal treatment and veterans' benefits. For years after the war, African veterans had to fight hard for recognition and equal treatment. Colonial governments didn't want to admit the contributions of their former subjects or fix the inequalities that still existed, so they were slow to give even basic veterans benefits. Pensions were small, healthcare was hard to get, and educational opportunities for former soldiers were limited. This lack of support was very different from how European veterans were treated, showing how colonial prejudice continued. The fight for recognition became part of the larger fight for independence, as African nations wanted to be in charge of their own futures and be respected in the world. The sacrifices of their soldiers showed the human cost of colonialism and made them even more determined to break free. Recently, more and more people are trying to bring attention to the forgotten contributions of African soldiers in World War II. Historians, filmmakers and writers are looking more closely at their stories, finding forgotten records and sharing the experiences of these unsung heroes. Memorials and museums dedicated to their service have been built across Africa and in former colonial powers, reminding us of their sacrifices and the unfairness they faced. Remembering their legacy isn't just about correcting history, it's also about understanding how much their service affected the 20th century. Their contributions to the Allied victory, made at great personal cost, helped to end colonialism. Their stories, full of bravery and the lasting effects of prejudice, show the strength of the human spirit and remind us how important it is to fight for justice and equality. World War II reminds us of how humans can cause destruction, but also how resilient we can be. In this global conflict, the contributions of African soldiers, often forgotten, show their incredible bravery and spirit. These men from all over Africa left their homes and families to fight in a war that showed them the horrors of combat and the unfairness of racism and colonial exploitation. Their stories, though often untold, are a key part of the war's history. From the hot deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma, they fought bravely, and their sacrifices helped the Allies win. They were skilled soldiers, smart strategists, and resilient survivors, overcoming the limitations imposed by a system that tried to hold them back. Their legacy is a powerful reminder of the complexities of war, the lasting impact of colonialism, and the human desire for freedom and equality. World War II was a global war, but it also started another fight for many African soldiers, the fight for self-determination. Fighting in the war and seeing the democracy and freedom they were supposed to be fighting for made them realize how unfair colonialism was in their own countries. The war, in a way, helped to create the African nationalism. When the veterans went home, they brought back not just injuries, but also the desire for change. They had seen that colonial powers could be defeated, had fought alongside men from different backgrounds for a shared goal, and had experienced, even briefly, the feeling of freedom. The war had changed them, making them more politically aware, which would fuel the independence movements across Africa in the years after the war. Their sacrifices in distant battles became connected to the fight for freedom at home, linking their service to the fight for a future without colonial rule. As time passes since World War II, it's even more important to remember and honor everyone who served, including the often forgotten sacrifices of African soldiers. Their stories, full of both incredible bravery and the lasting effects of injustice, are powerful reminders of how complex history is, the human cost of war, and the continuing legacy of colonialism. It's amazing that even during the horrors of war and racism, these men found ways to resist, to support each other, and to keep hoping for a better future. Their stories need to be heard, not just to get history right, but also to face the difficult truths of our past. By remembering their sacrifices, acknowledging the unfairness they faced, and celebrating their unwavering spirit, we honor their memory and make sure their contributions are never forgotten.